What are your thoughts on GLP-1 receptor agonists? Pretty hot topic. I've seen you put out some content about it, and I'll leave it open to you to kind of take it where you wish, and then we'll see. I have a little bit of knowledge of like some research on specific things about the topic that I can maybe contribute, but I'll see what you have to think about it or say about it rather.
Sure. Yeah, GLP-1 receptor agonists. I guess to give a brief background on that, your body produces, as you were talking about actually very early on about hormones and whatnot, your body produces all kinds of different hormones. One of those hormones that your body produces is this hormone called glucagon-like peptide. And that is a hormone that's released primarily by some cells in your intestines called the L cells. So these L cells will be activated. They get activated by the sensation of food. So if like food stuff enters the cell, then the cell has a bunch of receptors that ultimately recognize, okay, there's been a shift in the metabolic environment of the cell, which ultimately leads to gene expression for these genes that encode, have the information for the GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1, uh, information. So the information for the production of this protein. And those genes get read and then they get produced into a protein. Now you have the GLP-1 protein, and that gets ejected out of the backside of the cell. So because if you're talking about your intestines, you have kind of a front side, which is facing the actual intestinal wall. And then you have a backside, which is facing the blood side of obviously everything that moves from your intestines has to go from the inside of your intestines into your bloodstream. And glucagon-like peptide gets ejected out of the backside into the bloodstream. And then from there, it circulates through your bloodstream, and it has profound effects on your pancreas, for example. It can allow for greater release of insulin, which helps diabetics. The other thing that it does is that it can bind to your brain, and it changes your general drive to eat. And the way that it does that for your pancreas or for your brain, it binds to particular receptors on your brain. If you were to zoom in to your brain, there's a section of your brain called the hypothalamus, which controls a lot of your feeding behavior and a lot of your just general behavior overall. And inside that hypothalamus are a grouping of cells. There's the POMC neurons, so neurons being brain cells, POMC, POMC. And then you have these AGRP, NPY neurons, which is another grouping of cells. And they're very antithetic to one another in that these POMC neurons tend to downregulate hunger, and the AGRP, NPY neurons tend to increase hunger if they're become more active. So GLP-1 will bind to both sets of these neurons and decrease the activity of AGRP, NPY neurons, and will increase the activity of POMC neurons. And there's a lot of cross communication between these two groups of neurons. And the ultimate end result is that you end up consuming less. And it also has effects on your stomach and things like that, but I don't want to go too much into the mechanisms. That's the general idea of how GLP-1 works inside the body. And what these drugs do is that they mimic GLP-1, but they mimic GLP-1 in such a way that what chemists have done is that they've taken this protein, this GLP-1 protein, and slightly altered the chemical structure of it so that it is less likely to be degraded. So we don't have to just worry about the production of a protein. We also have to worry about the degradation of that protein, because if it gets produced and immediately gets degraded, then it's basically a futile cycle. It just gets produced and degraded, produced and degraded. So what researchers have done is they've slightly altered the structure of the protein so that when it gets produced, or I guess I should say in this case, because it's not coming from your genes, it's an actual injection. So you inject it into your bloodstream, and this slightly altered protein, then it can't be degraded nearly as easily. It can still be degraded, but it's just degraded at a far, far slower rate. So typically GLP-1 is degraded by a protein called DPP-4. And when that protein tries to interact with this particular synthetic version of GLP-1, it tries and it can't degrade it into, essentially break it down into nothingness. So this GLP-1 receptor agonist will float around in the bloodstream for as much as a week, sometimes more, and will continue to interact with all these receptors and will continue to modulate the brain, this specific area of the brain called the hypothalamus, and continue to affect the pancreas in such a way that it accentuates all the positive effects of GLP-1, the GLP-1 that we produce in our body. So with diabetes, it'll increase secretion of insulin and thereby decrease blood sugar. Because it has such a potent effect on our food consumption habits, it dramatically reduces our food consumption, which then ultimately leads to significant weight loss, significant fat loss, which then translates to any number of different outcomes. If that's reduced, you could, I don't want to say cure, but it can certainly significantly help treat diabetes. It helps against cardiovascular disease. It helps against cancer. It helps against all the major diseases it helps against. And the side effects of this particular drug class are pretty mild up to now that we know of. That may change as we get more and more data. And of course, we're getting tons of data because so many people are starting to use them. But the side effects tend to be like nausea, vomiting, headache, things like that, which I know obviously don't sound exactly very appetizing, but it's not like it's causing cancer or something like that, which would be disastrous. There's some discussion on potential muscle loss, but from the literature that I've looked at, which I looked at a bunch of meta-analyses that we just talked about, and those didn't indicate anything related to muscle mass. To be clear, they didn't actually measure it, so I can't say, oh, there's no effect on muscle. It's just that they didn't measure it. So anecdotally, there's some complaints that people can lose muscle mass, especially when they go from a very high weight and end up dropping a ton of weight. They may lose some muscle mass, but I think that kind of stuff can be mitigated by simply just resistance training a little bit more, consuming a little bit more protein, which should be things that you're already doing. So if you're adding this kind of therapy to your life when you're already trying to make some small changes to your life, I think it's probably going to have mostly an additive benefit. And there's going to be the few exceptions where it just has disastrous consequences. And of course, that's honestly always the case. That's if you hop on a low carb diet or a vegan diet or whatever diet you end up doing, whatever intervention you end up doing, you're always going to have a few people that have really bad reactions. And it's just the nature of how science works. You talk about averages, you talk about the population. It's going to affect 95% of people this way. We can predict that, but there's going to be a small percentage of people that are just going to have adverse effects. So that's my spiel on GLP-1 receptor agonists.